Hey, YouTube, we're going to get our economic update. There was only one legitimate, posted one in the Discord, thank you. There's only one legitimate video talking about how inflation can be fixed not only by lowering wages and lowering jobs. I spent like 15 to 20 minutes watching various financial, videos. And every one of them, the solution is we got to make the middle class and lower class lives worse. That's the only solution that these oligarchs and their media apparatuses have to inflation. Thankfully, I found this video here by Yanis Varoufakis, a Greek philosopher and economist. It's a little long. I don't know if we'll have time for the whole thing. It's fascinating, though. So let's get into it as quickly as possible. Real quick, I just wanted to show an example of what I'm talking about from Ken Klippenstein here. CNN is upset that more Americans haven't lost their jobs due to Fed rate hikes, all while the meager welfare systems we have are being dismantled. That was the title from this post by this person who put this post by Work Reform. Ken Klippenstein said, CNN openly lamenting job numbers being too high, the horror. And like I said, this is the only solution being offered. We got to cut wages. We got to cut jobs. There's no profit skimming. We can't go after the oil companies or the grocery store companies or the fill in the blank companies that increase their prices astronomically beyond what was necessary to cover inflation. And they profited mega off of our suffering, and they continue to do so. And the only way, Larry Silverstein, there's a Jon Stewart interview, talking about, he looks like a creepy weirdo, this fucking banker oligarch, talking about how we gotta make people suffer. He didn't really say that. I'm being, but you know what I'm saying is that this is their only idea for a solution. So let's go ahead and get this update from Yanis Varoufakis, who is brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. Let's take a look.
Banking crisis. The collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in early March
I got to change my thing.
Destabilized major banks in Switzerland and in Germany, triggering fears of a wider downturn like the one that led to the Great Recession of 2007-2008. While at this point the crisis seems to have been somewhat contained, is this a sign of a broader structural problem? And what lessons, if any, have been learned since the Great Recession? I'll ask the world-renowned economist and former Greek finance minister.
Please don't call for the death of anybody in my chat. I see what you're saying, though, the longest yard.
This week's headliner, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis, thank you so much for joining us on Upfront.
It's my pleasure.
The abrupt collapse of the tech lending firm Silicon Valley Bank has had a knock-on effect that was felt really around the world. Switzerland's Credit Suisse Bank had to be rescued by government intervention, and Germany's biggest lender, Deutsche Bank, appeared to be teetering on the edge last week. People are saying that we're in the middle of a banking crisis. You wrote a piece last week. It was entitled, "Let the Banks Burn." Why do you think we should do that?
And he's not saying let people burn. He's not saying let everyone, go down with the ship here. To be very clear.
Number one is because it is absolutely impossible to stabilize a banking system which has been built, it's been designed almost, in order to be unstable.
That's right.
These mega banks and the smaller banks which live parasitically on other mega banks are constructed on unsound foundations, and no amount of tightening regulations, we saw the Dodd-Frank Act after 2008, 2009, can actually stabilize.
With all respect for Yanis here, we're just going to bring it up 1.25, just for the sleepy folks here, so we can keep this moving along.
Them. Now, once upon a time, 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, we didn't have an alternative but to try to stabilize the banking system. Today, however, we have new digital technologies which allow a decoupling of payment systems from credit intermediation. What do I mean by that? Up until this very moment, if you want to pay for a coffee at your nearest Starbucks or whichever outlet you like using a plastic card, a debit card, you need to have an account in which you put your savings in or your payroll, your pay packet, into a private bank. Well, that is no longer the case. We can have a digital wallet that is provided by our central bank, which in any case
Not the best.
is monitoring all our payments, and it is called upon to save the private banks when they teeter and fall. Like
It's the UFO set. Yeah, you know, I would love a set like this, but it is a little cornball.
in Switzerland with the Swiss National Bank, the central bank saving Credit Suisse. Now, why can't we have a digital wallet with the Fed if you're an American resident, or with the Swiss National Bank if you're a Swiss resident, or with the European Central Bank if you live in the Eurozone, where your savings are completely safe? It's just a utility. Money, when you pay for your coffee, you know, a few dollars or euros or whatever go from the row on the ledger of the central bank that correspond to you to the row that corresponds to the coffee shop. Savings can be absolutely safe, no question of even insuring them, because they will be sitting on the ledger of the central bank.
But
and then
let me ask you a question about that, though, because banks serve other functions as well. In addition to holding cash, they serve from lending to various forms of investment. Is it possible to resolve this destabilization problem purely by relocating our funds into these sort of centralized spaces that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. Because if your savings, if the savings of a corporation, of a startup, of a cooperative, if those savings are sitting on the ledger of the central bank, then they're absolutely safe. And then a private banker can come in and offer you or me or our audience intermediation services. They can offer us a higher interest rate than that of the overnight rate of the central bank in order to get our savings and to lend them to someone else. And that is a private sector initiative that should then be ruled by the rules of the market. And if that company goes under because they have taken on silly risks, they have not done their homework properly, then you can let them fall without there being a systemic problem. The reason why we are, all of us, are watching what's happening to the SVB Bank in California or Credit Suisse with bated breath is because of this conflation. We have put our payment system, which is so essential to the preservation of the economic order of things. We have
talking about being able to pay your bills
it in the same hands as the private bankers who take risks and who then hold society to ransom because they're too big to fail.
Exactly. Absolutely. In that same article, you say that the banking crisis this time around is actually worse than the one from 2007, 2008. Now, that one was considered by many the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of 19...
Thank you, Longest Yard. I'm doing my Ukraine segment after this is done. Hydro Dante there. Yeah, you don't need an army to conquer a country. That's what Putin doesn't get. You just need a strong central bank.
1929. It wiped trillions of dollars off of the global economy, and it resulted in millions of lost jobs. Why do you say this one is worse?
You're absolutely right. 2008, 2009 was a gigantic crisis that is comparable to 1929, unlike today. But when it comes to actual banks failing, it is, I think, absolutely right to say that this time we should be more worried about our banks, because in 2007, 2008, 2009, when regulators and authorities looked into the books of the banks that were failing back then, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Bank of America, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, and so on, they discovered gigantic amounts of fraud. Remember the predatory lending, all the subprime mortgages that were given to people who could never repay them, and that was done knowingly. That's what I mean by predatory lending. The derivatives that were falsely labeled as AAA rated by credit rating agencies. There was a lot of fraud and a lot of quasi-criminal behavior. Also, the regulation mechanism was very weakened by the Clinton administration. Today, when we look at the account books of the Silicon Valley Bank or even Credit Suisse, we find much higher capitalization, next to no fraud, some silly decisions regarding risk-taking, but nothing resembling the shenanigans that were the cause of the House of Cards falling one after the other in 2007, 2008. That should make us worried, because the rules were more or less respected by the banks that are failing today. Look at Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is far better behaved today than it was in 2007, 2008. That is leading me to the conclusion that this domino effect, which is causing our central banks to lose sleep and to come in with the heavy weaponry of bailouts, this crisis should make us more worried because this is much more of a systemic crisis and less the result of serial fraud.
Oh, interesting.
You wrote about
yeah. So he's saying that this it's not anomalous. Well, okay, yeah. He said it better. Let me just repeat what he said here because he said it way better than I could.
Of bailouts, this crisis should make us more worried because this is much more of a systemic crisis and less the result of serial fraud.
You wrote about
The whole
SVB's
system's
bankruptcy and fears around rising inflation, and you said something that was very interesting to me. You said international capitalism has never been able to get back on its feet after 2008. Can you explain what you mean by that and what role exactly inflation is playing in this crisis?
The major difference between 1929, which you mentioned, I think helpfully before, and 2008
I've said this before.
was that in 2008, 2009, the central banks and the governments of the G7 coordinated their actions, primarily their monetary policy. They printed up to 35 trillion American dollars and injected them into the financial system to refloat it. They had not done that in 1929. That's why we had the Great Depression, which was far worse than the Great Recession after.
Yeah, those guys were true capitalists. They were like, nope, the market's going to fix itself. And it did not. They needed the bailouts, and they avoided doing that at first. GM bailout, I think he's talking about, is that GM, the auto manufacturing company in America?
2008. However, at the very same time that the G7 were coordinating their monetary policy, which refloated finance, they were not coordinating when it came to investment policy and to fiscal policy. And while we had largesse lavished upon the bankers, $35 trillion being given to them effectively, after 2009, between 2009 and 2021, 2022, the height of the pandemic. While we had that largesse for the banking system, the financial circuits, we had coordinated or uncoordinated, at least synchronized, austerity in North Atlantic economies. We had the worst bout of austerity here in Greece, but then that spread over to the rest of the Eurozone, to the United Kingdom under George Osborne and David Cameron. In the United States, even though you had a small fiscal stimulus under Obama, the state governments were indulging huge austerity cuts. So overall, the United States economy was subjected to net austerity. Now, when you have austerity in the economy of the United Kingdom, of the European Union, of the United States, that depresses aggregate demand, that depresses investment at a time when you had gigantic injections of money. What then happens is, instead of industrialists, investors, looking at the falling price of money and saying, oh, this is great, money is becoming cheaper, I'm going to invest more in productive capacity, they do the opposite. They say, oh my God, for the Fed to be pushing interest rates to zero, for the European Central Bank to be pushing interest rates to minus 0.7%, things are bleak, I'm never going to invest. So they take the money that is provided by the central banks, and instead of investing in productive capacity, in green energy, in good quality jobs, what they did was they took it to the stock exchange, and they bought their own shares back, which boosted the share prices, boosted financial markets, boosted their bonuses, but did nothing to boost supply and investment.
These are called stock buybacks, and if you've ever worked for a big corporation, you've probably experienced that's on the stock market. You've probably experienced this. It's just a great way to make a shitload of fucking money, but at the cost of devaluing your own business.
That was the situation between 2009 and the height of the pandemic. During the pandemic, that's the first time when some of the monetary power of central banks is being used in order to boost the incomes of little people out there.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because as we think about the pandemic, there are a lot of economists who are saying, particularly with regard to this inflation question, that it was the relief packages that were generated and produced out of the pandemic, as well as support from governments that helped lead to this skyrocketing cost of living that we're witnessing right now. They talk about
they're really trying to put all the inflation we're experiencing on the couple bucks that they threw us during COVID. To keep the fucking gears wheeled so that we had money to buy shit with, and they had the audacity to blame the tuppence, the few pence that they threw us, the few bucks that they threw our way. Oh, that's why we're having all these problems. We should never do that again. We could never bail out the American public. They would get fucked. We could only bail out $1 trillion banking institutions.
so-called Great Resignation and the subsequent rise in wage inflation brought on by a post-lockdown labor shortfall. Now, in March of 2022, you wrote an op-ed for The Guardian where you argued that wage inflation should be welcomed, not treated like public enemy number one. But wage inflation really is being treated as the biggest threat versus, for example, asset price inflation. Can you explain why that's the case?
Rich people do not like to see wages going up. And they do not like.
Is that simple?
It really is.
It's really very simple. And they don't want to see interest rates going up when they have taken on so much debt. Wage inflation was never the problem. I think that, look, from a scale of 0 to 100, wage inflation accounts for 5% of the problem with inflation we have. It's minuscule, it's negligible, it's not worth speaking of. The real reason why we had a bout of inflation, why we went from disinflation.
No, Joe Biden means tested me out of my fucking stimulus. Thanks a lot, fucking Joe. How about that malarkey? Huh? I got more money from Trump than Joe fucking Biden, dog. Jesus Christ.
Inflation, from deflation to inflation in 2021, 2022 during the pandemic is the long-term decline
Beautiful
in
day out.
supply, in aggregate supply. 13 years of underinvestment.
I agree, Lenny.
American markets, American sectors, and European sectors to reduce their capacity to produce stuff. And then, during the lockdown, you have a gigantic disruption of supply chains. Suddenly, the ships stopped sailing, the lorries stopped driving, the trains stopped moving. So you had, at a time when
I don't know if Trump is, if you're trying to say ironically, Trump in this case is the lesser evil. If you're trying to unironically say that, you're not at the right place, homie.
Some people had a little bit of money, furlough wages and so on. You had 90% of supply disappearing. That's what caused prices to start increasing. Once they started increasing, after 13 years of negative inflation, then it was a free-for-all. So
the massive, obscene tax cuts that Trump gladly signed into law, the regulation that he eliminated that actually might have caused this entire issue with SVB, I guess that didn't happen. Fake news. What's the excuse on that one?
Suppliers used the short-term supply chain disruption as an opportunity to do something they had not managed to do for 13 years.
Not that Congress is the fucking friend of the American people when it comes to the economy. Let's be clear on that one, right? So it's not like anyone's a winner here, but Trump certainly isn't the fucking. He didn't help the economy. That's a fucking lie, dude. That's a lie.
To increase their prices, prices started skyrocketing, and if you compare the rate of increase in prices with the rate of increase in wages and the rate of increase in profits skyrocketed.
Gas prices were cheaper.
So it's not that wages were pushing up. I mean, for example, let me give you an example.
Let me pause you for a moment, though, because that's fascinating what you're saying, and yet we're getting a very different pushback. In the UK, which is experiencing its worst cost of living crisis in decades, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, asked workers to place their wage demands under, quote, quite clear restraint. And we're hearing that same sort of language here in the United States. Meanwhile, the media is full of experts who are talking about how the only way to curb...
It's a myth that the right wing perpetuate. I'm not saying anyone here is right wing, but it's the myth that the right wing perpetuate that Trump was somehow good for the economy. He's a fucking disaster for the economy, and he passed some extremely egregious tax cuts that, even Barack Obama would have probably blushed at.
Curb inflation is by doing what? Cutting jobs. So it seems like no matter what, even based on your analysis, workers are bearing the brunt even when they shouldn't. I want to ask you to give me a solution to this. How do we change that?
Well, I think the Bailey statement was actually shameful. He had lost the plot in the Bank of England. He had a lot to answer for, and he blamed the workers whose pay rises. Look at the pay rises in Britain. They've been minuscule compared to the rate of price inflation and to the rate of asset inflation under Mr. Bailey's watch. Blaming the workers is always the pastime of those whose wages are paid for by the ones who actually increase their profit margins during a period of inflation when wages are almost stagnant. So back to your question, which I think is the pertinent one. What should have been done instead? Well, a number of things. Firstly, look at energy prices. When you have, in the United Kingdom, you mentioned the United Kingdom, but also in the European Union, when you have something like 40% of electricity being generated by natural gas, whose price did spike because of the war in Ukraine, because of the disruption in supply chains and so on. But even kilowatt hours that were produced...
The poor don't fight back. And that's what I'm getting at. That's why I talk about my 3-step program. Because the poor don't fight back. And that's just the fucking truth of it. And poor people have a lot of excuses, and some of them are legitimate and some of them aren't. A lot of poor people say, I don't have the time for it. And some of them are lying, and some of them are telling the truth. Some people legitimately don't have time to even pay attention, even a minute of politics, and they got all kinds of other concerns. And a lot of people are apathetic, and they don't fight back. I had such high hopes for you. I'm not really in the mood to play the game, and I'm not really in the mood to argue with the Trump supporter. Okay? Bye-bye. You're not welcome here. I'm censoring you. Go cry in the fucking corner.
At zero marginal cost, go up by the same amount as kilowatt hours that are produced by natural gas. Then, there is a racket going on there. The energy companies are raking it in, taking advantage of the energy crisis, pushing up the rate of inflation, because when energy goes up much higher than it should do, let me put it this way, 2/3 of the increase in the energy price was not due to the increase in the inputs of producing electricity. It was pure price gouging.
I mean, if you're supporting Trump now in 2023, in April 8th, 2023, and you're fucking on that Trump train, I got no time for you. I got zero time for you. I have negative time for you. Okay? I'll give you a break if you voted Trump, and be like, he's different than Hillary. I don't know. I'm not really paying attention. I'll throw my, whatever. And then you're like, yeah, that guy was a jackass. That's a whole different scenario, right? But if you're like, yeah, I still support Trump. It's a good idea. I support authoritarianism, dictators. I support January 6th. I'm not interested in talking to you. I'm not interested in having you here. You're not welcome here. You're a fucking fascist who supported an insurrection, right?
Of consumers by the oligopolies that control our energy markets. So what should we do? If we really care about inflation, we should slap a huge windfall tax on those companies. In some cases, windfall taxes were applied to energy companies, but follow the money. What did they do with this money? They didn't give it to consumers. They didn't use it in order to keep energy prices down. They actually subsidized energy providers.
Absolutely.
Whose shareholders were the same ones as the energy producers. This is a complete racket. So inflation was being utilized by very few oligopolistic firms relative to the plethora of small businesses that were suffering at the time of the energy cost crisis in order to maximize their economic rents from society. And then they had the audacity to blame the workers and to demand wage restraint from nurses. From nurses, my goodness. During a period of, a COVID crisis when nurses kept our populations alive, who, can't pay their energy bills.
This seems to be part of a larger trend where every time there's a crisis, governments intervene, and ultimately it is the public that ends up paying the price, more often than not through austerity measures. A recent example of this is in France, where the government is forcing through a pension reform that includes raising the age of retirement. However, there has been a strong social reaction in France, with protests taking place around the country that have now been going on for weeks. Your party has supported these protests, but in your view, what can they achieve?
Well, they've given President Macron a very difficult time. He hardly sleeps at night. That's not to be scoffed at. But let me make the point, the crucial point, I think, because many commentators say, hang on, what's the big deal? He pushed up the age of retirement from 62 to 64. Well, that's not such a radical change. Well, maybe it doesn't sound very radical until you come across a startling statistic, demographic statistic. Did you know that a poor French worker, male French worker, lives on average 10 years fewer than a rich salary receiver living in Paris in one of the fancy arrondissements of the beautiful capital of France? 10 years difference. So essentially, when you're pushing up the pension age limit from 62 to 64, for a very large proportion of poorer workers, that means that they want to receive a pension for very much of their post-work life. You see, these austerity measures, which are essentially a kind of class war against the poor, they come as a very long list. I remember when I was negotiating with the International Monetary Fund, with the European Central Bank, with the European Union, and they were imposing austerity measures upon my people here
This
in
guy's
Greece.
legit.
That list began with some signature policy, like pension reform, they call it. And then once they managed to push through that, then a whole list of other, again, in inverted commas, reforms follows. So you have to understand that what the majority of the French public realize, is that it is the thin edge of the wedge. If they let this seemingly innocuous increase in the age limit go through, then a whole host of other policies are going to be implemented that will continue to redistribute income from those who are struggling to those who are very affluent.
Yes.
I want to close on a broader point you made.
And they're
in one of your
shameless.
recent talks.
They're shameless. They don't care. You're dying dead in the street. Does not fucking matter. Their gated community looks beautiful. And when I fly over, I don't see any of the poor. They don't fucking care.
You said that paradoxically, capital is doing so well that it is killing off capitalism.
True.
And that
I say this all
is
the
due
time.
to
I say this all the time, that if capitalism wants to keep its spoils, if it wants to keep this game going, it needs to shave off a little bit more for the poor. The capitalists that are running this boat have lost their goddamn minds. You know, it's like the dog meme. I've said this before, you know, where it's got the ball in his mouth. And and he's like fighting against the owner. He's like, no take, only throw. No take, only throw, right? And it's silly, it's stupid, right? Because I got to take the ball to throw it. That's the same thing with the capitalists. They want all growth, no wages, all growth, but you're not allowed to make any money. They want spending, they want constant spending and infinite eternal growth, but they don't want to give you money to do that with. They don't want to give you fair wages. They don't want to give you any fucking stimulus. They don't want to bail you out. And it's eating capitalism alive from the inside. They're like running an engine without oil. Exactly, Rob. Crying and protesting when SJWs from 20. Hey man, I'm on the record. You know that lady, that famous liberal, freaking out and screaming when Donald Trump won. You know, everyone made fun of her and memed her. I'm like, no, I'm right. That's where I was. That's where I was. It was a clear sign of a decline in American democracy. Was the election of Trump. A travesty.
New form of capital that is triumphing and undermining capitalism.
No poor, only rich.
Well, thank you for this, because my new book is coming out in September in London. It's called Techno-Feudalism. What has happened in the last 15, 20 years is a new form of capital has emerged within the internet,
Absolutely.
within the cloud. That's why I call it cloud
UNTV.
capital. If you look at the Amazon algorithm, the algorithm behind Facebook, the algorithms that are running e-commerce, they are doing two things at once. They are replacing markets, because the moment you visit Amazon.com, you've exited the capitalist market and you have moved into a realm that belongs entirely to an algorithm that belongs to one person, Mr. Jeff Bezos. Now that is kind of capital, but it is more than just a machine. It is a replacement of a market. It is a kind of produced means of modifying our behavior, because it tells us what we want to hear, sometimes what we don't want to hear, and we're convinced by that. I don't know about you, but Amazon gives me very good advice, and I usually follow it, because whenever I followed it, I ended up buying something that wasn't bad, a book that I wanted to read, or Netflix gives you a suggestion that in the end, you like. So you have a behavior modification machine, which is also a replacement for the market, which is also a kind of capital that for the first time in capitalist history, you and I are replenishing, reproducing for no pay. Every time you post a review on Amazon, every time you upload a video on TikTok, you're adding to the capital base of a conglomerate without being a worker. But remember, capitalism has two pillars. Capitalism has two pillars. One is markets, and the other is profit. Not rent, profit, entrepreneurial profit. Both these pillars are being demolished. As I said, Amazon.com is not a market, it's a market replacement. In a market, you have consumers, you and I can walk around wherever you might be, London, Doha, Athens, and we can go to markets, we can look around, we see the same things. If you and I enter Amazon.com and put in the search engine the same keywords, you will get different things from me. The algorithm is going to direct us to completely different suppliers that the algorithm determines, and the algorithm gets a cut of 30-35% from them. So Bezos is not making a profit, he's making a rent, which is equivalent of what a feudal lord used to make under feudalism. So the market has been replaced by an algorithmic variant of the land, which is owned by a feudal king called Jeff Bezos. This is just an example.
Of course.
Right? And profit has been replaced by rent. That's not capitalism anymore. So this is a nightmare
It's
for any
feudalism,
liberal,
yeah.
for anyone who used to celebrate capitalism as a place that generates competition of ideas, of products, and of methods of production.
It's anti-capitalist.
Yanis
It is.
Varoufakis, thank you so much for joining us on Upfront. It's a pleasure as always.
Amazing, amazing interview, huh? Amazing stuff over there in Al Jazeera. And this host, really good questions from this host. What's his name? This guy, I don't know his name. Mark Lamont Hill. Mark Lamont Hill. Amazing work from Mark Lamont Hill. And you know, to answer some of the questions here in the chat, talking about, you know, is do we always have to have money? And you know, I would say, you know, in our society, I mean, I would say it. Even our best, you know, kind of guess, which would be Star Trek, right? The luxury space communism of Star Trek. Even that was based off some really shaky stuff. Like the whole economy was basically formed off of the concept of never-ending food. The world in Star Trek got better after the Vulcans gave them a magic device that let them replicate food and other items instantly, the replicators. And there was also big inconsistencies like, okay, how did Jean-Luc Picard own his farm? Or his wine, I mean his vineyard. He's got a wine vineyard. Well, if no one owns anything in the Star Trek future, how did he own his vineyard? How does that work? Did he buy it with money or credits or? So I think the answer to this, my layman's opinion about, you know, how can we live in a world without capitalism, but without like a tyrannical, authoritarian style communism, right? How can we get the best of both worlds? I think we need, like I always say, we need a hybridized system. Certain things cost money, certain things don't. You know, if you want to sell your labor, you can sell your labor for credits, something. We're going to have to figure out something. There will have to be some kind of way to quantify the value of your labor and exchange that. Whatever it is, currency, whatever it is. Right? There will always be, as long as humans are laboring, there will always be a need to quantify that labor, and maybe not a need to commodify it, completely, but there will need to be a system in place to trade that labor fairly for proper compensation. And that's kind of a question that was too big for Star Trek. Right? It was just magic space replicator can make everything. We're kind of there. We're kind of not, though, because 3D printing of food exists, but it's not magic. You know, it's like it requires the same amount of materials in to get the same amount of materials out. Right? Because the end stage humans would have to be in its most advanced stages. Maybe. I disagree with the communists that say all we need is more communism. That's the solution. We just the communists that failed, they just didn't communist hard enough, and we need to double down. And it's the same thing with capitalists that say, oh, the solution to everything is we just need more capitalism. I disagree with that. I think human beings require a somewhat messy, hybridized system of socialism and capitalism. Similar to what we already have now, but just refined and, you know, drilled down with a transparent overlay that explains every piece and where the money's going. Where politicians are basically just functionaries doing what the people demand. So I disagree. I disagree with the folks, with the commies that say we just need more hardcore communism. We just got to go all in. I disagree with them just as much as I disagree with the capitalists. Kiddo. Oh, okay. I can hold them. 1 second. Got a baby. Come here, big boy. My big boy. Oh. Buckaroo. Buckaroony. This is my boy. His name is Zaphoid Beeblebrox. One of my favorite characters from Hitchhiker's Guide. That's his real name. Yep. It's the baby. Oh my God. Oh my God. Here you go, bro. I got you, boo. I got you. Oh yeah, baby. Someone's hungry. All right, YouTube, that's the end of my finance news. Now we're going to jump into our Ukraine news. Thank you so much.